That night, my father stood under the spotlight and thanked almost the entire room, except me. My mother sat right next to him, holding the microphone, and confirmed it in front of everyone. They thought I would stay silent like always, but when I placed the manila folder on the podium, his boss opened it before he could, and the retirement party turned into a moment the whole county could no longer ignore. My name is Reagan Bennett. I am 34 years old, and I am a licensed hydraulic and civil engineer. Tonight, I am the ghost haunting the furthest edges of the Grand Crystal Ballroom. The Alder Ridge Flood and Street Authority spared no expense on the retirement gala for its outgoing director, my father, Douglas Bennett. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden, forgiving glow over velvet-draped tables. Massive vinyl banners hung proudly from the vaulted ceiling, bearing his name in bold navy lettering, Douglas Bennett, a legacy of infrastructure and integrity. The ballroom hummed with the quiet clinking of crystal glassware and the low, self-important murmur of county officials, wealthy private contractors, senior civil engineers, and local business owners. Every person holding an ounce of influence or a lucrative municipal contract in Alder Ridge was present. I sat alone at table 42. It was the absolute last table in the room, shoved so close to the heavy oak exit doors that I could feel the cold draft creeping in from the lobby. It was a deliberate placement by my parents. I was close enough to see the brightly lit stage, proving to anyone who asked that I had indeed been invited, but pushed far enough into the dim shadows that no one had to actually acknowledge my existence. Above the main stage, a massive projection screen flashed a relentless, carefully curated loop of my father's professional triumphs. There was Douglas Bennett in a pristine white hard hat, pointing authoritatively at a newly poured concrete spillway. There was Douglas and my older brother, Mason Bennett, shaking hands enthusiastically with the state governor at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new transit hub. Slide after slide showcased the Bennett men building the county, taming the unpredictable floodwaters, and paving the future. Then came the family portrait from 5 years ago. My chest tightened automatically. I remembered that day perfectly. I remembered standing on the far left side of that frame, wearing a navy blue silk dress, smiling awkwardly into the sun. On the projection screen tonight, the image had been cleanly and ruthlessly sliced right where my left shoulder used to be. The frame now tightly and exclusively hugged my father, my mother, and Mason. I had been digitally severed from the family history, erased to maintain the aesthetic of the perfect three-person unit. The applause rolled like heavy thunder as Douglas stepped up to the podium. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, flashing that trademark, camera-ready smile that had successfully secured him 3 decades of inflated county budgets. He began his speech, delivering a masterful, practiced performance of false humility and folksy charm. He spoke uninterrupted for 20 minutes. Then came the gratitude portion of the evening. It started normally enough. He thanked the County Board of Supervisors. He thanked the hardworking taxpayers of Alder Ridge. But then the net of his gratitude grew absurdly wide, catching absolutely everyone in its mesh except the daughter sitting quietly in the back. He thanked his beautiful wife, Lorraine, calling her the unwavering rock of the Bennett family. He thanked his son, Mason, praising him as the brilliant young mind who would undoubtedly carry the Bennett infrastructure legacy into the next century. He thanked his executive secretary of 15 years. He thanked his personal driver. He thanked the head of county vehicle maintenance. He even paused to point a finger gun at the sound technician working in the back booth, thanking him profusely for keeping the microphone from squeaking during his speech. The list went on and on. The catering manager, the local florist who arranged the centerpieces. Every single name he called out was a deliberate, heavy brick added to the wall he was publicly building between me and my own blood. It was not a lapse in an old man's memory. It was an execution of character by calculated omission. The room was settling into a polite, sleepy rhythm when a voice suddenly cut through the conditioned air. It came from table 12, somewhere right in the wealthy middle of the room. A retired structural engineer who had known our family for over 3 decades leaned forward in his chair. "What about Reagan?" he called out. His voice was not exceptionally loud, but in the quiet, reverent lull of the speech, it echoed perfectly off the acoustic ceiling panels. The entire ballroom froze as if struck by ice. Hundreds of heads swiveled in unison. First, they looked toward the stage. Then they turned toward the back of the room, scanning the heavy shadows for table 42. On the stage, Douglas's warm smile turned instantly rigid. The corners of his eyes tightened, betraying a microscopic twitch of raw, unfiltered irritation. He opened his mouth, likely to deliver a smooth, deflective joke to regain control of the narrative, but he never got the chance. My mother, Lorraine Bennett, was seated at the primary VIP table, right at the edge of the stage. She calmly pushed back her chair and stood up. She picked up a spare wireless microphone resting next to her water glass and turned to face the vast crowd. Her posture was rigidly perfect, her voice perfectly steady, dripping with the icy, polite composure she had weaponized over a lifetime of country club luncheons. "There is no need to mention her tonight," my mother said, her voice amplifying with crystal clarity through the state-of-the-art sound system. "She is not worth mentioning." The silence that followed her declaration was absolute and crushing. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that rapidly sucks the oxygen out of a massive room. Not a single person coughed. Not a single chair scraped against the floor. 400 influential people had just witnessed a public disowning, sanctioned by both parents, broadcast in high-definition surround sound. They fully expected me to shrink down into my chair. They expected me to grab my purse and run out the heavy oak doors behind me, crying in total humiliation, just like I would have done 10 years ago. I stood up. I did not scream a single word. I did not knock over my glass of sparkling water. I simply reached down to the empty chair beside me and picked up a thick, battered manila folder. I stepped out from the shadows of table 42 and began the long walk down the center illuminated aisle. My heels clicked sharply against the polished hardwood floor, creating a steady, metronomic beat that measured the distance between my silent past and my impending present. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead on the stage. I could physically feel the collective, burning gaze of hundreds of people tracking my every movement. I saw powerful county supervisors leaning away from the aisle as I passed, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure. I saw Mason, my golden boy brother, go completely pale, his hands gripping the edge of the VIP table so tightly that his knuckles glowed white under the chandeliers. This was clearly no longer a domestic dispute over a bruised ego. The sheer physical weight of the thick folder in my hands, combined with the steady, cold rhythm of my approach, signaled to every seasoned politician and hardened contractor in that room that the safe boundaries of family drama had just been violently breached. I was not a hurt little girl seeking emotional validation. I was a licensed civil engineer carrying a highly destructive payload. I reached the carpeted steps of the stage. Douglas stared down at me, his face twisting into a mask of furious, undisguised disbelief. I walked smoothly up the 3 steps and crossed the elevated platform. I did not look down at my mother. I did not glance at Mason. I walked straight past my father's imposing figure and stopped right at the edge of the wooden podium. Sitting directly adjacent to the podium was Naomi Kerr. She was the county administrator, the highest-ranking government official in the room, and the one person who held the absolute legal power to audit my father's entire agency from the ground up. She was sharp, notoriously pragmatic, and intolerant of political nonsense, and she was watching me with the focused curiosity of someone who knew this was about to matter. I placed the heavy manila folder squarely on the polished wood of the podium. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that carried through the microphone. I rested my hand flat on the worn cardboard cover, feeling the thick stack of printed schematics inside. I looked directly into Naomi Kerr's sharp eyes. "Ms. Kerr," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly without needing the microphone. "This document contains vital technical revisions and legal compliance records concerning the Willow Bend Floodgate Modernization Project. It requires your immediate administrative review." Douglas lunged forward, his carefully maintained composure shattered into a million pieces instantly. He threw his arm aggressively across the podium, his heavy hand clamping down hard over mine, desperately trying to drag the folder off the stand and out of public sight. "This is a private family matter," he hissed through clenched teeth, his face flushing a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. "Security will escort you out right now." But Naomi Kerr was already standing up. She moved with shocking, fluid speed for a woman in her late 50s. She stepped right up to the front of the podium, her presence forming an absolute, immovable wall of governmental authority. She placed her hand firmly over my father's wrist, forcing his frantic movement to freeze completely. "If it concerns the Willow Bend County Infrastructure Project, Douglas, it is absolutely not a private matter," Naomi stated. Her voice was pure cold steel. She smoothly slid my father's heavy hand away, pulled the battered manila folder toward her side of the podium, and flipped it open under the bright reading light right in front of his face. Growing up in the small town of Belmere, deep within Alder Ridge County, felt less like living in a community and more like existing inside a sprawling monument my father was actively building. The Bennett name was stamped on the side of heavy county maintenance trucks, etched into the bronze dedication plaques of municipal water treatment plants, and murmured with absolute reverence in the fluorescent-lit aisles of the local hardware store. For decades, Douglas Bennett was the undisputed king of concrete and floodwater. To be a Bennett in Belmere was to be local royalty. But even in royal families, the hierarchy is established brutally early, and the spares are quickly and permanently separated from the heirs. Mason was 3 years older than me, and from the exact moment he could walk without stumbling over his own feet, he was my father's designated shadow. He was given his own miniature yellow hard hat by the time he was 6 years old. On Saturday mornings, while I sat quietly on the living room rug, my father would proudly hoist Mason up into the high cab of his lifted county truck. He would announce to my mother that he was taking the boy out to the spillway, his voice booming with the heavy, self-important weight of a man actively passing down a dynasty. Mason was the anointed successor. He was the golden boy who would inherit the earth, or at least the paved and heavily piped sections of it that fell under county jurisdiction. I, on the other hand, was drawn to the invisible, silent forces that made my father's massive concrete structures actually hold their ground. I loved math. I loved the absolute, undeniable, and impartial truth of physics. While Mason was out learning how to firmly shake hands with local aldermen and contractors, I was sitting alone in my bedroom, meticulously calculating flow rates and stress loads on scrap paper. I was a straight-A student, quietly winning every regional science fair Alder Ridge County had to offer. When I was 12 years old, I won the state mathematics decathlon. I was so immensely proud that my hands physically shook as I used 2 heavy magnetic clips to center the glossy, gold-embossed certificate right in the middle of our stainless steel refrigerator door. In our house, that space was prime real estate. I went to bed that night imagining my father seeing it while he poured his morning coffee, maybe finally giving me that slow, approving nod he always reserved for Mason. But when I came down to the kitchen at exactly 7 o'clock the next morning, the certificate was already gone. In its exact place hung a freshly printed, glossy photograph of Mason and my father holding up a pair of mallard ducks they had shot on a weekend hunting trip. I frantically searched the kitchen and finally found my state math award neatly folded in half, sitting quietly at the bottom of the blue plastic recycling bin. When I confronted my mother about it, Lorraine did not yell. She never raised her voice. Instead, she had mastered the insidious art of the suffocating, conflict-avoidant whisper. She calmly wiped down the granite kitchen counter with a damp yellow sponge, completely refusing to meet my burning eyes. She told me not to make a big deal out of nothing. She murmured that I knew exactly how my father was, that he was just so incredibly proud of his boy, and that my piece of paper was taking up a lot of room. She told me to just let it go. My mother was the soft velvet glove over my father's heavy iron fist. She was the quiet, smiling enabler who legitimized his blatant, daily favoritism by constantly framing it as just an eccentric quirk of his passionate personality. The real emotional turning point The exact moment the hairline fracture in my heart widened into a permanent structural break happened during a Tuesday night dinner when I was 15 years old. I had spent 3 grueling months building a highly complex working-scale model of a hydrodynamic water pump for the Regional Engineering Expo. I had won first place overall. The senior judges had specifically and publicly praised my advanced understanding of fluid dynamics. I carried the heavy, intricate wooden and plastic model down to the dining room table, my chest swelling with a desperate, pathetic, and distinctly childish hope. I carefully set it down near my father's plate, just as he was pulling out his chair. I started to explain the mechanics of the pump, my words rushing out in an eager, breathless torrent. Douglas looked at the model for exactly 2 seconds. Then, he raised his large hand and physically pushed it aside. The wooden base scraped harshly and loudly against the polished oak dining table, shoving my 3 months of meticulous hard work dangerously close to the edge. He commanded me to make room, not even bothering to look at my face. He announced loudly that Mason had news. Mason puffed out his chest and declared he had secured a part-time summer contract doing administrative filing at the county surveyor's office. It was a low-level paper-pushing job my father had undoubtedly handed him with a single phone call. Yet, my parents immediately erupted in joyous, overwhelming applause. My mother rushed to the kitchen to pour sparkling cider into tall glasses. My water pump model teetered silently on the edge of the table, entirely forgotten. I realized then that my father did not actively hate me. It was actually much worse than hate. I simply did not exist on his radar at all. This soul-crushing dynamic solidified permanently when I was 18 years old. I was officially awarded a full-ride academic scholarship to study civil and hydraulic engineering at the premier state university. It was a massive financial and academic achievement, worth over $40,000 a year. The university hosted a formal, catered banquet to honor the top 10 engineering scholars in the entire state. I used my own savings to rent a nice dress. I proudly reserved 3 seats at my assigned table. I sat alone in that grand hall for 2 solid hours. My family never walked through the doors. They had chosen instead to attend a local charity golf tournament because the county planning commissioner was playing in my father's foursome, and they decided Mason desperately needed the networking opportunity. When I returned home late that night, the house was completely dark. The next morning, Lorraine gently patted my arm while pouring her herbal tea. She recited perfectly from her mental script, telling me how incredibly proud they were of me, delivering the required words without a single ounce of genuine warmth or eye contact. She claimed they really wanted to be there, but my father had pressing county obligations. She assumed I would understand, but she did not ask a single question about the banquet. She did not ask about my declared major. The words civil engineering were strictly forbidden in our house unless they were firmly and exclusively attached to Mason's name. I finally stopped trying to force my way into their carefully curated family frame. I finally understood the fundamental physics governing my own home. The problem was not that I was not smart enough, or not accomplished enough, or not trying hard enough to win their love. The problem was entirely structural. In the grand, sweeping, historical narrative of Douglas Bennett, the great builder of Alder Ridge County, there was only room for a male heir. I was a girl who happened to like concrete, steel rebar, and water pressure. I was a glitch in his grand legacy. I was merely a supporting character who had accidentally wandered onto the wrong stage. That afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and stared at the blue recycling bin. I did not throw anything away. Instead, I turned around and went straight up to my bedroom. I gathered my university scholarship letter, my heavy science fair medals, and my state math certificates. I did not walk back down to the refrigerator. I sat at my heavy wooden desk and slowly opened the bottom drawer. It was dark, dry, and entirely mine. I laid the documents perfectly flat against the bottom wood. I pushed the drawer closed, sealing it tight. I learned a vital, survival-based lesson that day, a lesson that would shape the entire trajectory of my professional life. If the people who are legally and morally supposed to protect your history absolutely refuse to acknowledge it, you must become your own private archivist. You must build your own indisputable paper trail in the dark. That bottom drawer became my silent sanctuary. It was the quiet, unassuming, and highly necessary birthplace of the thick manila folder I would carry with me years later. I packed my life into a rented sedan 2 days after graduation and drove 350 miles north to the city of North Briar. I chose it precisely because it was far enough away that the Bennett name held absolutely zero currency. In North Briar, the heavy county public works trucks bore different logos. The municipal bronze plaques featured different local politicians, and I was finally allowed to exist as an independent variable. I accepted a junior civil engineering position at Ironcrest Water Systems, a mid-sized, aggressively practical private consulting firm. We did not build glamorous glass skyscrapers or sweeping aesthetically pleasing suspension bridges. Ironcrest specialized entirely in the gritty, subterranean, and vital arteries of civil infrastructure. We designed urban flood relief channels, concrete diversion culverts, and heavy-duty storm control gates. It was exactly the kind of environment where I wanted to build my life. My direct supervisor was an imposing woman named Celeste Rowan. Celeste was a veteran structural engineer with 30 years of hard field experience and absolutely zero patience for corporate posturing. She was a woman who practically lived in reinforced steel-toed boots and tailored wool blazers, possessing a highly analytical mind like a steel trap and an eye that could spot a single millimeter of structural misalignment on a massive blueprint from 10 feet away. She did not coddle her junior staff. She did not offer warm, fuzzy affirmations just for showing up to the office on time. But within my first 3 weeks on the job, she recognized exactly what kind of technical mind I possessed. Under Celeste's demanding guidance, I dove headfirst into the unglamorous, grueling reality of hydraulic engineering. While junior associates at other competing firms chased high-profile aesthetic design awards, I spent rigorous 60-hour work weeks running relentless hydraulic flow models and calculating extreme velocity rates. I ran highly complex digital scour simulations to analyze exactly how violently rushing stormwater would chew away at submerged concrete foundations over a span of 50 years. I calculated the exact shear stress and maximum load limits on massive steel gate mechanisms. It was exhausting. Highly technical work performed entirely behind the scenes, but I loved it because it was undeniably honest. Mathematics does not play favorites. A structural load calculation either holds the required weight or it fails catastrophically. The uncompromising physics of water pressure do not care about who your father is, what your last name happens to be, or who you play golf with on Sunday mornings. My daily calculations directly impacted whether a dense residential neighborhood stayed dry during a Category 4 hurricane or drowned under 6 feet of toxic, muddy runoff. That heavy realization grounded me in a way nothing else ever had. I worked relentlessly, studying through my weekends, and at the age of 28, I passed the grueling 16-hour state examination to become a fully licensed professional engineer. Earning my PE designation was not just about receiving a nice framed certificate to hang on my cubicle wall. It was a monumental legal and ethical threshold in my career. It meant I was officially authorized by the state board to physically stamp and sign civil blueprints. That heavy rubber stamp meant I personally carried the absolute legal liability, the financial responsibility, and the moral weight of public safety for every single structure I approved. It was a terrifying and profoundly empowering professional milestone. I was one of the youngest engineers in Ironcrest history to earn it. I sat at my desk, staring at the official state email confirming my passing score. Despite all the bitter history, a small, stubborn, foolishly hopeful part of me still wanted to share this massive news with the man who had built his entire public identity around the concept of infrastructure. I picked up my cell phone and dialed my parents' house. My father answered on the third ring. I took a breath and told him I had officially received my PE license. There was a brief, empty pause on the other end of the line. He let out a soft grunt of acknowledgement, offering a flat, highly generic note of congratulations that sounded exactly like he was reading it off a teleprompter while simultaneously checking his email. Before I could even begin to explain the magnitude of the projects I would be legally allowed to lead now, he seamlessly hijacked the conversation, his voice suddenly filled with booming, genuine enthusiasm. He proudly announced that Mason had just been officially appointed as a senior project coordinator within the Alder Ridge County Planning Department. I knew exactly what that vague title meant. It was a manufactured administrative desk job, heavily padded with local tax dollars, requiring absolutely zero actual engineering credentials, designed solely to keep Mason positioned comfortably near the seat of municipal power. My father spent the next 10 minutes detailing Mason's new corner office and his increased salary band. I listened silently to the entire monologue, my throat painfully tight, before quietly making a polite excuse to end the call. I hung up the phone and stared blankly at my computer monitor. I felt a familiar, hollow ache settling deep into my chest, but this time, I absolutely refused to let it paralyze me. Celeste Rowan walked past my open door, stopped abruptly, and took one long look at my face. She did not ask me intrusive questions about the phone call. She simply walked in, pulled up a spare chair, and sat down beside me. She looked at the PE confirmation email glowing brightly on my screen. She told me that from this specific day forward, my professional signature was my absolute most valuable asset and simultaneously my biggest potential liability. She leaned forward, her voice dropping into a serious, uncompromising tone. She instructed me to keep a personal hard copy of absolutely everything I ever signed. She told me to meticulously archive every technical drawing, back up every single email chain, and maintain a rigorous time-stamped revision log for every minor design change I ever authorized. Celeste told me that true professionalism is never about paranoia. Professionalism is understanding the harsh reality that human memories fade. Corporate loyalties shift instantly, and people will lie straight to your face when millions of dollars are on the line. But a meticulously maintained paper record will always speak the absolute truth on your behalf. I took her warning as absolute gospel law. I immediately developed an obsessive, meticulous habit of technical documentation. I created heavily encrypted digital folders for all my time-stamped computer-aided design files. I printed physical hard copies of critical client meeting notes and filed them away in locked metal cabinets. I saved every single email chain where a contractor requested a material alteration or a design shortcut. What started as standard professional diligence slowly morphed into a deep-seated psychological armor. I was fiercely determined that my professional history, unlike my personal one, would never be erased, cropped, or rewritten by anyone else. This quiet, daily discipline of relentless archiving was the invisible foundation being firmly laid for the exact moment I would eventually walk up to that wooden podium at my father's retirement gala. 3 years later, the steady, predictable rhythm of my life at Ironcrest was violently interrupted by a highly unusual request. I was walking back from the staff break room with a cup of black coffee when I saw Celeste standing near the main reception desk, signing a clipboard for a thick, sealed courier package. It was prominently marked with a bright red urgent delivery sticker. As I walked past the desk, my eyes caught the intricate, gold-embossed seal stamped heavily on the front of the thick manila envelope. It was the official municipal seal of Alder Ridge County. A sharp, cold knot instantly formed in the pit of my stomach. Ironcrest rarely took municipal contracts from that specific southern region, as the county commissioners usually kept everything deeply in-house or handed it out to local, deeply entrenched firm allies. An emergency, out-of-town consulting contract meant someone at the county management level was absolutely terrified, and they desperately needed an independent, legally binding third party to look at a severe problem they could not fix quietly themselves. I walked back to my desk, trying to shake off the sudden, heavy sense of impending dread. 2 hours later, Celeste walked directly into my office. She was not smiling. She carried a thick stack of printed schematics and a formal legal non-disclosure contract. She dropped the heavy pile squarely onto the center of my desk. The impact made my ceramic coffee cup rattle loudly. She looked at me with a grim, intense professional focus, and told me our firm had just been retained by a state oversight board to conduct an emergency rapid response hydraulic audit for a major municipal project down in Alder Ridge. The state regulators had flagged some highly concerning mathematical irregularities in the initial engineering surveys, and the county was legally forced by the governor's office to outsource the review immediately to an independent firm. I slowly reached out and pulled the top document toward me. The bold black text printed at the top of the title page seemed to burn straight into my retinas. The project was titled The Willow Bend Floodgate Modernization. It was a massive, multi-million-dollar infrastructure overhaul. But more importantly, I knew exactly what Willow Bend was without needing to read the summary. I had read about it in the local online papers for 2 solid years. It was the absolute crown jewel of the Alder Ridge Flood and Street Authority. It was the grand, sweeping capstone project heavily promoted across the state as the ultimate, career-defining retirement legacy of its visionary director, Douglas Bennett. And now, his flawed, failing legacy was sitting right on my desk, waiting for my red pen. Willow Bend was not just a simple concrete wall holding back a muddy river. It was a massive, highly mechanized guardian tasked with protecting the entire lower basin of Belmere from total destruction. The geography of the region was essentially a giant bowl, and the floodgates were the only thing keeping the valley dry when the heavy spring rains came pouring down the surrounding mountains. If those specific gates failed during a severe weather event, the rushing water would not just ruin a few residential basements, it would immediately swallow the Alder Ridge County Hospital. It would drown 2 public elementary schools. It would completely submerge the Central Logistics Warehouse District and wipe out the primary municipal bus depot. Thousands of lives and hundreds of millions of dollars in public assets depended entirely on those massive steel barriers operating flawlessly under the most extreme pressure imaginable. For 3 solid years, my father had used this exact infrastructure project as his personal crowning achievement. The local newspapers frequently featured glossy, full-page spreads of Douglas and Mason standing victoriously on the half-finished concrete embankments, pointing at blueprints they barely understood. County board meeting minutes, promotional flyers, and heavily funded budget campaigns were completely saturated with the Bennett name. Douglas had confidently sold Willow Bend to the taxpayers as his flawless retirement legacy, framing it as the ultimate, enduring gift of safety to the town he had supposedly built from the ground up. But a routine, state-level preliminary review had quietly thrown a massive, unavoidable wrench into his meticulously planned victory lap. State engineers, cross-referencing new extreme weather predictive models, noticed a glaring discrepancy. The projected storm surge volume data simply did not align with the foundational erosion metrics submitted by the Alder Ridge internal design team. It was a massive red flag that could not be swept under the rug. Terrified of a public scandal that could instantly freeze millions of dollars in state funding, the county administration was legally forced to hire an external firm to conduct a highly confidential, rapid response audit. They needed someone out of town, someone completely detached from local politics, to quietly fix the math before the state board officially halted construction. Celeste Rowan assigned me as the absolute technical lead for the hydraulic review. She did this because I was undeniably the strongest engineer in our entire office when it came to complex flow velocity modeling and heavy gate energy dissipation systems. I locked the door to my office, pulled up the heavily encrypted digital schematics, poured a massive cup of black coffee, and started tearing my father's legacy apart line by agonizing line. It took me exactly 3 intense days of running continuous computer simulations to find the catastrophic error, and the reality was far worse than a simple mathematical typo. It was a compounded, systemic failure that bordered on criminal negligence. The original county design drastically underestimated the severe foundational scour that would inevitably occur during a sudden flash flood. The sheer velocity of the rushing water would literally eat away the earth and rock beneath the concrete footings, undermining the entire structure. But the truly fatal flaw was entirely mechanical. The maximum torque load calculations for the massive steel lifting arms were dangerously wrong. If heavy storm debris, like a massive submerged tree trunk or a crushed vehicle, jammed against the closing gates during a violent surge, the automated motor logic would not recognize the physical blockage. The massive industrial gears would just continue grinding relentlessly against the obstruction until they completely stripped their own teeth, leaving the heavy gates permanently paralyzed in the wide-open position. The terrifying reality of this engineering failure was its deeply insidious nature. If Alder Ridge had built the facility exactly according to my father's approved blueprints, it would not have collapsed immediately on a bright sunny afternoon for everyone to see. The tragedy would have been a slow burn. The system would have degraded quietly, suffering invisible structural fatigue and microfractures with every minor seasonal rainstorm. The gears would weaken incrementally. The deep foundation would silently wash away inch by inch. The facility would wait patiently for years until the exact moment a massive, unseasonal storm hit the valley. Then, when the town desperately needed the gates to close, the entire system would seize up and fail catastrophically, drowning the lower basin with absolutely zero warning in the dead of night. I spent the next 4 weeks practically living under the fluorescent lights of my office. I survived almost entirely on stale vending machine food and sheer adrenaline-fueled focus. I had to completely redesign the entire defense matrix from the ground up while racing against a ticking state deadline. I spent 48 hours straight calculating the precise dimensions for heavy rock riprap and articulated concrete floor mats to properly armor the riverbed foundation against extreme erosion. I completely rewrote the complex programmable logic controller parameters, meticulously coding a fail-safe backup sequence. This new logic would instantly halt and automatically reverse the heavy motors if the torque resistance spiked by even 10%, permanently preventing a catastrophic gear failure. I upgraded the shear strength requirements for the massive steel anchor bolts, holding the entire mechanical assembly to the concrete walls. Most importantly, I drafted a strict, legally binding operational manual that demanded rigorous physical and mechanical inspections within 24 hours of any significant rainfall. As I finalized the hundreds of pages of complex technical revisions, the crushing, undeniable weight of my professional license settled heavily onto my shoulders. This was not a theoretical university physics exercise anymore. I was preparing to apply my state-registered engineering seal to these revised blueprints. By doing so, I would legally and morally own the true safety of the Willow Bend floodgates. If my math was wrong by a single decimal point, and the county hospital flooded, the state investigators would not look at my father. They would look directly at me. I was taking on the absolute liability for a project that bore his name in bold letters, 2 days before the final electronic handover deadline. My private office phone rang. The digital caller ID displayed a completely blocked number, but the exact moment I picked up the heavy plastic receiver, I recognized the deep, commanding breathing on the other end of the line. Douglas Bennett had somehow utilized his vast network of county connections to discover exactly who Ironcrest Water Systems had assigned to audit his failing masterpiece. He did not say hello. He did not ask how my life in North Briar was going. He certainly did not offer a single word of gratitude for the fact that I was currently working myself to the bone to save his multi-million-dollar vanity project from becoming a deadly statewide catastrophe. His voice was a low, harsh whisper, vibrating with suppressed panic and furious, absolute authority. He told me he knew I was the one handling the technical revisions. He ordered me to finish the math, fix the structural problem immediately, and keep my mouth completely shut about the original errors. Then, he delivered his final, uncompromising demand. He explicitly commanded that when the final approval package was sent back to the county clerk's office, my name and my professional engineering signature were not to appear anywhere on the finalized public documents. He desperately wanted the structural safety and the foolproof mechanics I had painstakingly engineered, but he absolutely refused to let the permanent public record show that his forgotten, discarded daughter was the only person capable of saving his grand legacy. He hung up the phone sharply before I could even take a single breath to reply, leaving me sitting in total silence, listening to the dead dial tone echo in my small office. The secure digital transfer took exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds to complete. When the progress bar on my computer monitor finally hit 100%, I leaned back in my heavy office chair and exhaled a breath I felt like I had been holding for an entire month. Through the official encrypted channels of Ironcrest Water Systems, I had successfully handed over the fully corrected, legally stamped technical rescue package for the Willow Bend floodgates. On a purely structural level, the catastrophic danger was completely neutralized. The massive concrete walls would not crumble under extreme pressure, and the heavy steel gates were now programmed to reverse automatically if debris jammed the gears. I had done my job perfectly. I had saved the lower basin of Belmere from a disaster they would never even know almost happened. 3 weeks later, a lingering, uncomfortable professional instinct drove me to log into the public engineering portal for Alder Ridge County. I simply wanted to verify that the updated operational manuals had been officially attached to the public registry. I navigated through the labyrinth of municipal menus until I found the master file for the Floodgate Modernization Project. I opened the primary blueprint document and scrolled straight down to the bottom right corner, looking for the standard revision title block. My eyes froze entirely. The designated space where Ironcrest Water Systems should have been clearly listed as the external auditing firm was completely blank. More terrifyingly, my official professional engineer seal was entirely absent from the digital page. Instead, a generic, newly typed line of text proudly credited the structural salvation to an entity called the Alder Ridge Internal Rapid Response Design Revision Team. My father had effectively erased my existence from the project entirely, officially claiming my grueling, life-saving technical corrections as his own department's brilliant internal victory. The sheer audacity of the theft made my blood run incredibly cold, but what I discovered next stopped my heart completely. I clicked over to the State Environmental Compliance tab. To secure the final release of the massive state funding grants, the county had to submit a formal letter of structural acceptance, swearing under penalty of perjury that a qualified expert had rigorously reviewed and approved the specific hydraulic safety mechanisms. I pulled up the digitized document. There, sitting blatantly in Box 14, subsection B, the line strictly reserved for the supervising technical director, was a signature I had known since childhood. It was Mason. My older brother, a man with no engineering degree and a made-up administrative title, had formally signed off on a life-or-death flood control system. Even worse, written directly beneath his name was a multi-digit professional certification number that looked entirely fabricated. He had legally certified a complex floodgate system he did not understand. Using credentials that were not his, I did not send an angry email. I did not make a phone call. I drove 240 miles south the very next morning and walked straight through the back door of my parents' house just as they were finishing their Sunday morning coffee. The kitchen, usually smelling of warm vanilla and roasted pecans, instantly felt like a highly pressurized interrogation room. I slapped the printed copy of the state compliance form directly onto the granite island counter, right between my father's heavy ceramic mug and my mother's folded newspaper. I pointed a shaking finger directly at Mason's signature. I demanded to know exactly why my legally binding seal had been scrubbed from the public record and why an unqualified project coordinator was blindly signing state safety documents using a phantom credential. Douglas did not even blink. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his dark coffee, completely unbothered by the heavy piece of paper sitting right in front of him. He casually waved his large hand through the air, completely dismissing my panic as a hysterical, feminine overreaction. He told me I was entirely missing the bigger picture of how municipal government actually worked. He claimed the signature was just a standard internal directive, a minor bureaucratic formality required to keep the funding timeline moving quickly without getting bogged down in external contractor red tape. Then, he seamlessly flipped the script, his voice hardening into a low, threatening growl. He aggressively accused me of being petty and vindictive. He said I was actively trying to sabotage my own brother's rising career and recklessly plotting to ruin the flawless Bennett family reputation over a simple bruised ego. I turned desperately to my mother, waiting for the voice of reason to finally intervene. Lorraine carefully folded her Sunday paper and pushed it aside. She did not look at the forged document. She looked down at the polished hardwood floor. She spoke in that soft, suffocating, conflict-avoidant whisper that I absolutely despised. She pleaded with me not to make a mess. She begged me to just wait until my father officially retired in exactly 6 months before I started asking difficult questions. She asked me to put the family's public dignity ahead of my professional paranoia, essentially demanding that I treat a massive felony as a minor social inconvenience that could simply be swept under the rug until the retirement cake was safely cut. Standing in that immaculate, sunlit kitchen, a profound and horrifying clarity washed over me. This was no longer a sad, emotional story about a daughter desperately wanting her parents to love her. This was about a massive public works record being deliberately and illegally falsified. It was about forged signatures attached to a structure holding back millions of gallons of water. If Willow Bend ever suffered a mechanical failure, the ensuing legal and financial devastation would be apocalyptic, and the fraudulent paper trail would lead directly back to a man who did not even know how to calculate basic water pressure. Yet, as I looked at my father's defiant jaw and my mother's pleading eyes, an incredibly foolish, profoundly human weakness kept my mouth shut. I did not pull out my cell phone and threaten to call the state inspector general right then and there. Deep down, buried under the heavy layers of professional outrage, a tiny, pathetic fragment of my heart still harbored a toxic, desperate hope. I stupidly hoped that if I gave him enough time, the sheer weight of his own conscience might force him to correct the record himself. I hoped he might eventually call me, admit the lie, and finally offer a genuine word of thanks. I turned around and walked out of their house without saying another word. I drove all the way back to North Briar in absolute silence, but I did not simply let it go. Instead of screaming in a kitchen, I chose to do something far less dramatic, but infinitely more dangerous. I walked into my quiet office, locked the heavy wooden door, and began to silently build an impenetrable fortress of truth. I printed every single computer-aided design file with its unalterable digital timestamp clearly visible. I printed the encrypted email chains from the county server expressly directing the removal of the Ironcrest name. I took high-resolution snapshots of the falsified public registry before anyone could quietly delete the digital evidence. I sat at my desk and meticulously wrote down a verbatim transcript of the entire conversation that had just occurred in that Belmere kitchen, noting the exact time and date. I opened the heavy bottom drawer of my desk. I reached into the back and pulled out a completely blank, rigid manila folder. It was such a remarkably small, ordinary object. I carefully placed the thick stack of damning evidence inside and closed the cover. I told myself it was just a temporary measure, a quiet insurance policy I would hopefully never have to use. But as I slid the drawer shut and turned the small metal key, I knew exactly what I had done. I had just planted the lethal, undeniable seed that would eventually grow to tear my father's entire world apart. 3 years passed, 36 long, suffocating months of grinding silence and perfectly executed public relations. During that time, the Willow Bend Floodgate Modernization Project was officially completed, heavily photographed, and proudly christened. It instantly became the defining centerpiece of Alder Ridge County. My father and Mason were practically elevated to local municipal sainthood. They were constantly heralded in the local gazette, honored at town hall meetings, and praised at county fundraisers as the visionary saviors of the regional infrastructure. I watched from afar, sitting quietly in my North Briar office, as my brother stood on the newly poured concrete embankments, smiling widely for the cameras while cutting thick red ribbons. I was completely vanished from the official narrative, a ghost cleanly excised from the public history books. A year after the ribbon-cutting ceremony, I received a formal piece of certified mail at the Ironcrest Water Systems office. It was an official letter of professional commendation from the State Environmental Evaluation Board. After conducting their mandatory, highly rigorous post-project review, the state regulators sent a legally binding document expressly acknowledging my specific, critical role in redesigning the hydraulic failsafes. It was a powerful, undeniable piece of physical evidence validating my reality. The state engineers knew exactly who had saved the basin. I drove down to Belmere that weekend for a rare, obligatory family dinner, carrying the folded letter in my purse. I waited through the entire meal, giving my parents a wide-open opportunity to bring it up, knowing perfectly well that the state had sent duplicate copies to the county director's office. No one asked a single question. No one even casually mentioned it. The situation rapidly escalated from a matter of stolen professional credit to a matter of active, ongoing public danger several months later. An email appeared in my inbox from a man named Victor Hale. Victor was not a corporate spy or a dramatic whistleblower trying to secretly take down the local government. He was simply a senior county maintenance technician, a highly pragmatic man who wore heavy work boots, carried a clipboard, and cared deeply about keeping massive machines running smoothly. Victor had been tasked with conducting a routine dry run test of the Willow Bend lifting mechanisms. During the test sequence, one of the massive steel arms shuddered violently, screamed against its own housing, and briefly jammed before painfully forcing itself open. Victor was thoroughly confused, so he dug deep into the county digital archives and managed to find a buried, pre-scrubbed email chain that listed my name and my direct firm contact information. He attached his physical maintenance log to his email. In a very blunt, entirely blue-collar tone, he explained that the shortened internal operation manual my father had quietly substituted into the official record was fundamentally wrong. It explicitly instructed the maintenance crew to use standard industrial grease and conduct visual inspections only once every 6 months. My original, heavily researched technical mandate had strictly required marine-grade synthetic lubricant and rigorous sensor-based torque testing every 14 days due to the extreme moisture environment of the river basin. Standard grease would simply emulsify and wash away under that kind of intense hydrostatic pressure, leaving raw steel to dangerously grind against raw steel. My father and brother had not just erased my name, they had dangerously simplified the critical maintenance protocol because it looked significantly cheaper and far less labor-intensive on the annual county budget report. I did not treat Victor like an informant in a spy thriller. I simply thanked him for his diligence, told him he was absolutely right to be concerned, and advised him to keep a personal copy of his test results. Then, I immediately printed Victor's maintenance log. I printed his subsequent, completely ignored follow-up emails begging Mason for technical clarification. I pulled my original, properly stamped design recommendations from my secure external drive. I placed all of these documents into the manila folder residing in my bottom desk drawer. The thin, rigid cardboard was beginning to stretch at the seams, bulging heavily with the physical weight of suppressed truth. I sat at my desk and stared at the thick folder for a very long time. A profound, irreversible emotional shift occurred in that quiet office. The burning, desperate childhood need for my father's approval finally burned itself completely out, leaving nothing but cold, hardened ash in my chest. I was no longer waiting for a belated apology or a tearful cinematic family reconciliation. I realized I was keeping the folder solely because I was absolutely terrified. I knew with absolute engineering certainty that if those heavy gates permanently seized during a severe spring storm, the innocent people living in the lower basin would pay the ultimate, devastating price for my family's vanity. The folder was no longer a symbol of a personal grievance. It was a highly loaded weapon kept behind emergency glass. During the agonizingly rare holiday dinners I still forced myself to attend, the dining room felt exactly like a surreal, deeply uncomfortable stage play. Lorraine would gracefully pass the roasted vegetables, maintaining a terrifyingly perfect facade of domestic bliss, acting as if the air was not thick with unspoken lies. Douglas would confidently hold court at the head of the polished table, loudly recounting his latest administrative triumph at the Willow Bend facility, describing the concrete structure as his personal gift to the community. Mason would sit quietly next to him, either offering weak, subservient murmurs of agreement or staring intently at his plate, absolutely refusing to offer a single syllable of technical correction. I sat in utter silence, mechanically chewing my food, physically feeling the phantom weight of the manila folder sitting miles away. Then, the official invitation arrived. It came enclosed in a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing raised gold lettering. The Alder Ridge Flood and Street Authority cordially requested my presence at a grand catered gala celebrating the monumental retirement of Douglas Bennett. It was printed on the exact kind of heavy, expensive cardstock that automatically commanded social respect. 2 days before the event, Lorraine called my cell phone. She did not ask if I had found a suitable dress. She did not ask if I was looking forward to the evening. Her voice was thin, incredibly tight, and painfully polite. She told me that my father had worked incredibly hard for decades and that he deserved to have a perfectly peaceful night. She said she hoped I understood how vitally important it was to keep the focus entirely on his legacy and not cause any unnecessary distractions. The words were phrased as a gentle, motherly request, but the underlying tone was unmistakably a strict, ironclad command to remain invisible and keep my mouth completely shut. It was a calculated, preemptive strike against any lingering professional dignity I might still possess. I hung up the phone and walked straight over to my closet. I picked out a simple, unassuming navy dress. Then, I drove to the Ironcrest office in the dead of night, unlocked my heavy desk, and retrieved the swollen manila folder. I decided to attend the party. I brought the damning documents with me simply as an insurance policy, a quiet source of internal strength to firmly hold on to while I sat in the shadows of the ballroom. I genuinely intended to sit quietly at my assigned table, eat my catered dinner, and discreetly drive away when the speeches were over. I was fully prepared to let them have their hollow, fabricated victory. That was my exact plan, right up until the specific moment my parents stood together on that brilliantly lit stage, held a microphone, and publicly declared to an entire room of my professional peers that their only daughter was not even worth mentioning. The heavy oak doors of the grand crystal ballroom swung open, and the suffocating heat of 400 packed bodies hit me instantly. I clutched the thick manila folder against my side, stepping into a space that had been meticulously engineered to be a shrine. This was not a retirement party. It was a coronation. In the grand foyer, right before the main dining area, sat a massive glass-encased scale model of the Willow Bend floodgates. Flanking the miniature concrete walls were life-sized, professionally lit portraits of my father and Mason, both wearing matching hard hats and broad, victorious smiles. A gold-plated placard rested on the velvet table beneath the model. It read, "The Bennett Family, serving Alder Ridge County for decades." My stomach turned over. It was a flawless piece of historical fiction, built with taxpayer money. I found my assigned seat in the dimmest corner of the room. The air was thick with the smell of roasted beef, expensive floral arrangements, and the intoxicating hum of municipal power. A man sitting to my left, wearing a sharp gray suit and a name tag, identifying him as a regional concrete supplier, glanced at my place card. He looked closely at my face, squinting slightly in the low light. "Reagan Bennett," he read aloud, his voice carrying a cheerful, oblivious tone. "You must be Douglas's daughter. I have to be honest with you. I have been doing business with your father and Mason for 15 years, and I have never once heard your name mentioned in any of the family projects." It was not a deliberate insult. He was just a businessman making idle cocktail conversation, but his casual observation was a jagged knife twisting right between my ribs. It was the absolute proof of their success. My family had starved me out of the narrative so completely that my very existence was a piece of trivial trivia to the people who built our town. I forced a tight, polite smile, unable to form a single word in response. 15 minutes later, my mother drifted through the outer tables doing her standard crowd control. She was wearing a stunning emerald green gown, her hair perfectly styled, holding a crystal glass of white wine. She spotted me sitting in the shadows. She did not lean down to hug me. She did not ask how my drive from North Briar was. She stopped exactly 2 feet away, the standard distance for a casual acquaintance, and offered a brittle, practiced smile. "So glad you could make it," Lorraine said, her eyes rapidly scanning the room over my shoulder to ensure the catering staff was refilling the water pitchers. "Enjoy the dinner." She turned and walked away before I could even nod. That tiny, freezing interaction crystallized everything. I was not her child tonight. I was merely a potential liability that needed to be visually managed. She prioritized the flawless aesthetic of the event over the living, breathing daughter sitting right in front of her. When Douglas finally took the stage, the psychological pressure in the room became incredibly dense. He was a master of the room, weaving stories of late-night concrete pours and hard-fought budget battles. He controlled the emotional temperature of the crowd with the ease of an orchestra conductor. He was actively writing the final chapter of his life story in real time, locking in the myth of the heroic Bennett men. And just like I had experienced when I first walked in, he meticulously listed his gratitudes, deliberately weaving a net that caught everyone but me. Then came the moment I had opened with the interruption that split the room in two. A voice from the center asked the question no one else dared to ask. "What about Reagan?" Douglas let out a booming, forced chuckle, gripping the edges of the podium to ground himself. He tried to brush it off as a joke, preparing to pivot back to his script, but Lorraine was faster and infinitely more ruthless. She grabbed the spare microphone from the VIP table. "Let us not lose focus tonight," my mother's voice echoed, sharp and cold as shattered ice. "She is not worth mentioning." The ensuing silence was not just the absence of noise. It was a heavy, suffocating, physical entity that pressed down on the chests of 400 people. The entire room became utterly paralyzed. I watched the faces of the county supervisors, the safety inspectors, and the wealthy contractors. Some stared intently down at their half-eaten meals. Others nervously adjusted their silk ties or nervously tapped their water glasses. A few exchanged highly uncomfortable, sideways glances, but absolutely no one stood up. No one spoke a word of defense. The collective silence of the Alder Ridge elite became an active, cowardly participant in my public humiliation. They were perfectly willing to let a daughter be slaughtered on the altar of her father's ego as long as the municipal contracts kept flowing. Sitting in that heavy, suffocating quiet, the final, terrifying realization washed over me. The true horror of this moment was not the verbal insult. I had survived a lifetime of their emotional neglect. The true horror was that my parents were officially closing the book on my existence right in front of the exact people who had directly benefited from my exhaustive labor. These silent officials in the room were the people who desperately relied on the Willow Bend floodgates to keep their families from drowning. By publicly erasing me here, tonight, Douglas and Lorraine were permanently cementing a dangerous, fraudulent lie into the county's historical record. I could not let the lie stand. The manila folder on my lap felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, heavy with documents that could not stay buried. I stood up. The scraping of my chair against the hardwood floor sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Lorraine saw me rise. Her perfectly composed mask cracked, revealing sheer, unadulterated panic. She dropped her microphone on the table and practically sprinted from the VIP section, intercepting me right at the edge of the center aisle. She reached out and clamped her manicured hand violently around my right wrist. Her nails dug painfully deep into my skin. "Sit down right now," she hissed, her voice a venomous, terrified whisper meant only for me. "Do not ruin this." I stopped. I looked down at the woman who had spent 34 years telling me to make myself smaller. I did not yell. I did not cry. I raised my left hand and gently, methodically peeled her trembling fingers off my wrist one by one. "I am not causing a scene, Mother," I said, my voice eerily calm and steady. "I am simply not sitting down anymore." I stepped past her and walked straight to the stage with the folder in my hands. Mason looked terrified. My father looked furious. And I placed the documents on the podium without saying a word to either of them. I looked directly down into the sharp, calculating eyes of Naomi Kerr, the county administrator. I took a deep breath, preparing to tear the Bennett legacy down to its absolute foundations. My father's heavy hand slammed down onto the manila cover the exact second I released it. His large knuckles instantly turned bone white under the harsh stage lighting. He leaned directly into the podium microphone, his breath heavy and erratic, desperately attempting to project his standard, booming authority over the stunned crowd. "I sincerely apologize for this highly unusual interruption," Douglas announced to the paralyzed room, his voice strained tight with barely concealed panic. "This is an intensely private family matter. My daughter is clearly confused tonight. We will handle this outside immediately. Security, please step forward." He tried to forcefully drag the folder off the wooden stand, but Naomi Kerr was already there. She did not raise her voice. She did not call for the guards. She simply placed her open palm flat against the center of the battered cardboard cover, applying a firm, absolute, and immovable downward pressure. "If those documents pertain to the Willow Bend Public Works project, Douglas, then this is not a private family matter," Naomi said. Her tone was completely devoid of emotion, which made it utterly terrifying. "Remove your hand from the evidence." Douglas hesitated for 3 agonizing seconds. He looked out at the 400 faces watching his every move. He realized in real time that pulling the folder away by brute physical force would instantly confirm his overwhelming guilt to every politician in the room. Slowly, his rigid fingers uncurled. He took one single, defeated step backward. Naomi smoothly slid the folder toward her side of the podium and flipped the heavy cover open. She calmly retrieved a pair of reading glasses from her tailored suit jacket and put them on. The crisp sound of the thick paper turning was picked up by the sensitive microphone and broadcast perfectly across the breathless ballroom. The very first page was a scaled-down, high-resolution copy of the Willow Bend Structural Revision Blueprint. Stamped prominently in the bottom right corner with dark blue ink was the unmistakable circular seal of a registered professional engineer. Slashed directly across the center of that legal seal was my personal signature. Naomi looked up from the blueprint, her sharp eyes locking directly onto mine. She did not ask a long, dramatic question. She simply waited for me to formally enter my statement into the public record. "That is the officially revised hydraulic schematic," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room without the aid of a microphone. "It contains the specific mechanical corrections and foundation reinforcements I engineered to prevent the primary gates from permanently jamming open during an extreme high-volume rain event. The original county design was structurally flawed and posed a catastrophic risk to the lower basin." A low, collective, and deeply unsettled murmur rippled through the back of the room. The seasoned municipal contractors and city planners sitting at those dimly lit tables instantly understood the massive gravity of that statement. This was definitively no longer a spicy piece of local family gossip. This was a catastrophic engineering failure being dragged forcefully into the blinding light. Naomi did not react to the shifting crowd. She methodically turned to page 2. It was a printed copy of the internal county email chain. I had used a bright yellow highlighter on the most damning paragraphs. Naomi read the text silently to herself for 10 long seconds. Then, she leaned slightly closer to the microphone and read it aloud. Her enunciation razor-sharp. "From the desk of the director, direct quote, erase the external consultant name from the final master file. Credit the Alder Ridge Internal Rapid Response Team. Clean up the record entirely before the state inspectors arrive next month." End quote. The restless murmur in the ballroom instantly died. The silence that replaced it was incredibly dark, dangerous, and legally loaded. Tampering with a public works record to hide a structural failure was not a minor administrative misdemeanor. It was a severe, career-ending felony. The wealthy politicians who had been casually sipping expensive wine 5 minutes ago were suddenly sitting rigidly upright, their minds racing to calculate their own political proximity to the blast radius of this massive scandal. Douglas lunged toward the microphone again, his face a deep shade of crimson. "That is completely fabricated. It is a printed piece of paper. Anyone with a computer can type that up to look official." Naomi ignored his outburst completely. She moistened her thumb and turned to the third document. It was the State Environmental Compliance Form. It was the specific document legally certifying that the revised safety mechanisms had been rigorously tested and approved by a qualified expert. Naomi stared intensely at the signature line. She looked at the printed name, and then she looked directly over the edge of the stage. zeroing in on the VIP table where my brother was sitting. "Mason," Naomi called out. Her voice cut through the heavy air like a steel blade. "You personally signed the technical verification form for the primary lifting arm assemblies." Mason froze entirely. His golden boy posture evaporated. He looked exactly like a deer trapped in the headlights of a speeding freight train. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat seized, and no sound came out. Naomi looked back down at the paper, her brow furrowed deeply. She traced her index finger slowly along the line of text directly beneath his forged signature. The color rapidly drained from her face. She realized exactly what she was looking at, and the devastating administrative implications hit her like a physical blow. This specific compliance form was the mandatory legal prerequisite for the $4,500,000 state infrastructure recovery grant, Naomi said, her voice dropping an entire octave, completely losing its calm detachment. She turned her head very slowly to look directly at my father. "Douglas, if this signature is not tied to a valid, state-issued engineering license, you have just committed massive federal grant fraud. The State Oversight Board will demand the entire $4,500,000 back by the end of the fiscal quarter. This county does not have that money." The sheer financial terror of that statement broke the room wide open. Chairs scraped violently against the hardwood floor as several county supervisors stood up abruptly, their faces pale with pure administrative panic. They did not care about family drama, but they cared deeply about a multi-million-dollar deficit that would ruin their re-election campaigns. Douglas realized he was entirely cornered by the undeniable math and the physical paper trail. The polished, charismatic leader was gone. He desperately attempted to change the battlefield entirely. He stepped away from the podium, adopting the slumped posture of a deeply wounded, heartbroken patriarch. He looked out at the frantic crowd, shaking his head slowly, attempting to squeeze a single pathetic tear from his eye. "You all have to understand the tragedy of this situation," Douglas pleaded, his voice trembling with brilliantly manufactured grief. "Reagan has been deeply unwell for years. She has been horribly estranged from this loving family. She holds these terrible, paranoid delusions about her brother and me. She brought this fake folder here tonight specifically to ruin my retirement, because she is profoundly sick." He reached his hand out toward me, offering a grotesque public pantomime of fatherly concern. "Sweetheart, please stop this. Let us take you home and get you some real psychiatric help." It was a masterful, deeply sinister performance. He was relying entirely on the oldest, most reliable societal playbook in existence, dismissing the competent woman as completely hysterical and unstable. For a split second, I saw a few faces in the crowd actually soften with genuine sympathy for his manufactured plight. But Naomi Kerr was not a woman who made critical infrastructure decisions based on emotional theatrics. She was a hardened administrator who worshipped cold, hard data. Naomi snapped the manila folder shut. The sharp smack echoed loudly across the ballroom, instantly cutting off his performance. "The digital metadata stored on our encrypted county servers will tell us exactly who is sick and who is lying," Naomi stated coldly, obliterating his narrative with one sentence. She reached into her tailored suit pocket and pulled out her cell phone. "I am freezing the Willow Bend project file effective immediately. I am instructing the county IT department to lock out your administrative credentials tonight. Douglas, the legal department will take physical custody of every single document in your office first thing tomorrow morning." The absolute finality of her words shattered the remaining illusion. Douglas's broad shoulders completely collapsed. The invincible, untouchable titan of Alder Ridge was instantly reduced to a terrified, desperate old man caught in his own trap. Down at the VIP table, the immense pressure finally broke the weakest link. Mason realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that the protective umbrella of his father's municipal power had just been completely obliterated. He was staring straight down the barrel of a massive fraud investigation, and his name was the only one written in blue ink on the fraudulent state document. Mason practically scrambled out of his chair, violently knocking over his expensive crystal water glass. It shattered loudly against the polished floor. sending ice and water everywhere. He did not look at me. He did not look at our mother, who was sitting frozen in her emerald gown. He looked directly up at Naomi Kerr, raising both of his hands in a frantic, cowardly gesture of total surrender. "I did not know what the form meant," Mason shouted, his voice cracking into a high, panicked pitch that echoed horribly through the silent room. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at the man standing on the stage. "He told me to sign it. Dad explicitly told me it was just an internal procedure. I just did exactly what he told me to do." The morning after the grand gala, there were no flashing police lights in my parents' driveway. Real municipal downfalls rarely happen with dramatic arrests at dawn. They happen in the quiet, sterile hum of administrative offices and the sudden dropping of eye contact in the local grocery store. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Naomi Kerr had fully executed her authority. She issued a county-wide directive freezing every single digital and physical file associated with the Willow Bend project. The County Information Technology Department locked down the servers, securing all metadata and email histories before anyone could hit the delete key. She also quietly opened a comprehensive internal review of every major contract my father had overseen during his final 5 years in office. The public execution of his legacy was swift and entirely bureaucratic. His official county honoring ceremony, which was supposed to include a local government resolution, the unveiling of a cast bronze plaque, and the hanging of his portrait in the Civic Hall, was postponed indefinitely. The announcement was a single sterile line published in the Friday edition of the Belmere Gazette, in a town that ran entirely on social currency and whispered rumors. That one sentence was utterly devastating. The gossip mill at the local diners and hardware stores went into absolute overdrive. The phone at my parents' house, which usually rang 15 times a day with contractors and local politicians paying their respects, simply stopped ringing. Mason was formally placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a full legal inquiry. The Bennett men were effectively exiled without a single pair of handcuffs ever being produced, their social standing collapsing faster than any legal penalty could ever achieve. 72 hours after I walked off that stage, my cell phone vibrated on my desk. The caller identification displayed my mother's number. I answered it, expecting the usual quiet, suffocating reprimand. Her voice was brittle, trembling with a fragile anger she could barely sustain. She immediately accused me of deliberately destroying our family, crying that I had humiliated my father in front of the entire county. She asked how I could be so incredibly cruel to the people who raised me in the town that gave me everything. I let her finish. I did not raise my voice. I leaned back in my office chair and asked her a single question. I asked her if she had ever once picked up the phone to call me when I was losing sleep, terrified out of my mind because I knew a faulty dam was going to collapse and drown thousands of innocent people. I asked her where her fierce, protective, motherly panic was when my professional license and my entire career were being secretly stolen by the two men sitting at her dinner table. Lorraine did not answer. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out for 10 agonizing seconds, then 20. It was not her usual, weaponized silence designed to make me fold. It was the heavy, breathless silence of a woman whose carefully constructed reality had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces. For the absolute first time in my 34 years of life, I heard my mother quietly begin to weep with genuine, unscripted regret before she softly disconnected the call. Later that same evening, Mason called. The golden boy sounded entirely broken. The arrogant, booming confidence he had endlessly copied from our father was completely gone. He spoke in a rushed, frantic whisper, admitting what I already knew. He confessed he had blindly signed the compliance forms because our father had assured him it was just a tedious internal formality that no one would ever actually verify. He sobbed, saying he did not fully understand the severe federal legal implications of faking an engineering credential. He was terrified of going to federal prison and losing his entire future. I felt a brief, sharp pang of pity for him, but I did not offer him false comfort. I told him the absolute truth. I warned him that when the state investigators finally arrived, Our father would inevitably try to protect his own pension and his own legacy first. I told Mason that he was the only one who actually put pen to paper, making him the perfect, disposable scapegoat for the county to sacrifice. I explicitly advised him to drain his savings account and hire his own independent defense attorney immediately, completely separate from whatever legal counsel our father was arranging. I told him he could no longer afford to hide behind Douglas Bennett's shadow. Back in North Briar, the pieces of the impending hearing began to lock firmly into place. Victor Hale, the county maintenance technician, bravely agreed to cooperate fully with the independent review board. He formally submitted his original maintenance logs and provided a sworn affidavit confirming that my strict, heavily reinforced technical recommendations had been completely stripped from the final operating manual after the county quietly altered the paperwork. He was the vital, working-class proof that the corruption extended all the way down to the daily operations of the facility. My boss, Celeste Rowan, proved to be my greatest asset during the fallout. She did not coddle me or push me into the role of a fragile victim. She treated me like a lead expert witness preparing for a massive federal trial. We spent 14 hours a day locked in the Ironcrest conference room. She ruthlessly drilled me on my testimony. We meticulously organized the timeline of events, perfectly establishing the chain of custody for every single digital blueprint and printed email. She forced me to practice translating complex hydraulic friction coefficients and structural shear loads into plain, undeniable English that a panel of county supervisors could easily understand. She made sure I was armed with impenetrable data, ensuring no defense lawyer could ever twist my words. But just as the official date for the public county hearing was finalized, an entirely new, deeply terrifying variable entered the equation. The Regional Meteorological Center issued an emergency alert. A massive, highly unseasonal low-pressure system was stalling directly over the mountains above Alder Ridge County. Meteorologists were predicting 5 to 8 inches of rain within a 48-hour window. It was a rare and dangerous storm event that could push the local rivers to flood stage. The massive storm was scheduled to hit exactly 2 days before I was supposed to testify. The entire county collectively held its breath. The abstract, bureaucratic argument over signatures and professional credit suddenly became a terrifyingly real matter of life and death. Willow Bend was going to be forced to operate at maximum capacity, facing the exact extreme stress loads I had mathematically predicted in my darkest simulations. Sitting in my office, watching the dark radar clouds swirl on the computer monitor, I realized the profound, cruel irony of the timing. The upcoming storm would be the ultimate impartial judge. If the heavily reinforced gates held firm and operated flawlessly under the massive water pressure, it would be undeniable. Physical proof that my redesigned safety mechanisms were actively saving the town, exposing my father's reckless negligence for the entire world to see. But if the system somehow faltered, if the water breached the retaining walls, the catastrophic public consequences would completely eclipse any personal quest for justice. The concrete and the rising water did not care about the Bennett family drama. They only cared about the truth of the math. The morning of the official county hearing arrived, completely swallowed by the violent, unrelenting fury of the predicted storm. A massive deluge of rain lashed mercilessly against the tall, reinforced glass windows of the Alder Ridge Civic Center. Outside, the municipal streets were slick and dark, flooded with several inches of rushing water that overwhelmed the storm drains. Inside, the grand legislative chamber was packed entirely to its fire code capacity. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool coats, damp umbrellas, and nervous sweat. The entire county board of supervisors sat elevated behind a curved mahogany desk. Her room was packed with municipal lawyers, local investigative journalists, anxious city planners, and ordinary citizens who lived in the flood zone, all waiting to learn whether the concrete walls protecting their homes were actually unsafe. When my name was officially called, I walked down the center aisle and took my seat at the solitary witness table directly facing the board. I did not perform. I did not offer them a tragic, weeping narrative about a neglected daughter seeking her parents' affection. I presented myself exactly as Celeste Rowan had trained me to be: a licensed, highly competent civil engineer dealing strictly in indisputable facts. Speaking clearly into the microphone, I detailed the catastrophic mathematical flaws in the original Willow Bend design. I explained how the foundational scour metrics were deeply miscalculated and how the primary mechanical gears would inevitably seize under extreme pressure. Then, I explained the exact scope of my emergency revisions. I made it absolutely clear to the board that erasing an engineer's name from a finalized blueprint is never just a matter of stolen professional pride. It is a deliberate, highly dangerous destruction of the legal chain of custody. If a public structure fails, the state investigators must know exactly who calculated the load-bearing tolerances. By replacing my legal seal with a generic internal team credit, the county had effectively orphaned the safety liability of a multi-million-dollar asset. Douglas sat 2 rows behind me, his arms crossed defensively, fully prepared to claim that my printed documents were fabricated long after the fact by a bitter, estranged child. But he never got the chance to speak that lie into the public record. Naomi Kerr, sitting at the far end of the supervisor's desk, systematically dismantled his only defense. She projected the heavily encrypted digital server logs directly onto the massive screen behind the board. She calmly confirmed that the digital metadata, server timestamps, and original revision upload histories matched my printed folder exactly. The digital footprint proved I had submitted the life-saving corrections 3 years ago, and it proved exactly whose administrative account had subsequently ordered the scrubbing of my name. The hammer blows of truth continued to fall in rapid, merciless succession. Victor Hale took the sworn oath and sat at the witness table. Smoothing his rough hands over the fabric of his blue uniform, he confidently presented his handwritten maintenance logs. He testified under oath that the critical high-frequency inspection guidelines I had mandated were deliberately deleted from the final operating manual. He proved that the administration had systemically compromised the daily physical safety of the facility just to make the maintenance budget look more attractive on paper. Then came the final, devastating fracture of the Bennett dynasty. Mason was called to testify. He did not walk up to the table with his father. He sat down accompanied by an incredibly expensive, independent defense attorney he had hired the day before. Mason looked pale, completely stripped of his golden boy arrogance. When the lead county counsel asked him about the forged state environmental compliance form, Mason broke immediately. He leaned into the microphone, his voice shaking, and testified that Douglas had explicitly handed him the pen. Mason stated for the official record that our father had directly ordered him to sign the legal document, promising him that no one at the state level ever actually double-checks the technical paperwork. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. In his desperate attempt to save himself from federal prison, Mason completely sacrificed the man who had spent a lifetime building him up. I did not look back, but I could physically feel the exact moment Douglas realized he had lost his ultimate ally. His carefully constructed empire of loyalty had completely evaporated. Right in the middle of the heated questioning, the heavy oak doors at the back of the chamber swung open violently. The county director of emergency management walked swiftly down the aisle, his raincoat dripping wet, carrying a digital tablet. He approached Naomi Kerr and whispered urgently into her ear. Naomi nodded slowly, her expression intensely focused. She picked up her wooden gavel and struck the sounding block to silence the murmuring room. She announced that the region had just surpassed 7 inches of rainfall in under 14 hours. The local rivers had crested violently. Willow Bend was currently taking massive, unprecedented hits from heavy debris and extreme hydrostatic pressure. The entire room went dead silent, paralyzed by the real-time stakes. Naomi looked down at her screen, then looked directly at me. She announced that despite the severe overload, the facility's automated safety system had engaged successfully 11 times in the last 3 hours. The heavy steel gates were detecting the debris jams, automatically reversing their gears exactly as I had programmed them to, clearing the obstructions, and resecuring the perimeter perfectly. The structural foundations were holding flawlessly. The very concrete and steel I had redesigned were being tested in the middle of that storm, and the math was holding. The structure itself was actively proving exactly who had saved it. Realizing the absolute totality of his defeat, Douglas desperately gripped the microphone during his final statement. He attempted to spin the narrative one last time. He pleaded that he was under immense pressure to meet severe state funding deadlines. He claimed that bypassing the tedious external paperwork saved the taxpayers thousands of dollars. He insisted that in the gritty reality of municipal construction, everyone cuts corners to get the concrete poured. But his words completely backfired. By attempting to justify his actions as standard operating procedure, he proved to the horrified board that he fundamentally misunderstood the sacred, unyielding ethics of public engineering. He viewed public safety as a flexible political obstacle, not a rigid mathematical law. The board did not even retreat to deliberate. The vote happened immediately, right there on the open floor. It was unanimous. The county officially recorded my technical revisions, permanently attaching my professional engineering seal to the master Willow Bend file. They voted to forward all forged signature documents directly to the State Licensing Board and the Federal Grant Oversight Committee for immediate criminal investigation. They mandated a strict new tracking protocol for all future design alterations. Finally, in a swift, merciless administrative stroke, they passed a binding motion to strip the name Douglas Bennett from every single plaque, banner, and dedicatory document associated with the Floodgate project. The storm finally broke late the next afternoon. The heavy, dark clouds fractured, letting bright shafts of golden sunlight pierce through the cold air. I drove out to the lower basin and parked my car near the edge of the access road. I stood on the wet observation deck, gripping the cold steel railing. Below me, millions of gallons of muddy, turbulent river water roared safely through the massive concrete diversion channels. The heavy steel gates stood resolute and unyielding against the immense current. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the clean, rain-washed air. I felt an incredible, profound sense of quiet peace settle deep into my bones. I did not need my father to look at me with pride anymore. I did not need my mother to acknowledge my existence at a dinner party. I did not need the Bennett family to write me into their manufactured history. The cold, hard truth of the county records and the flawless, life-saving operation of the physical structure had spoken entirely on my behalf. I had built an undeniable legacy out of steel and truth, and for the very first time in my life, my reality belonged entirely to me. Thank you for listening. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and if you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and hit the hype button to help more people find this channel.